Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. They are Tyler Calvaruso and Daniel Gowan. We have plenty to discuss on this episode. We're going to bounce a lot of topics your way, and we're going to begin with some offseason standouts from the football program. And remember, 50 new players on this roster, a new coaching staff. There's been a lot of feedback. We're going to kind of steer clear of some of the headline names that we've discussed a lot in recent months about who jumped on board and who did big things at Iowa State. And we're going to talk about some guys maybe at other portions of the depth chart that we haven't brought to the podcast as much and kind of deliver what we're hearing on them. This is a team that hasn't put on the pads yet. That won't happen until March 24th. But based on off-season workouts, based on some developmental process, who are the Penn State players that warrant a longer look here before this team gets back on the field? We'll dive into that topic to start things out. We'll ultimately work our way for the first time in a long time into a basketball discussion. Penn State hoop season ended earlier this week with a opening exit from the Big Ten tournament, a loss to Northwestern. Really a rough season all around for Penn State hoops. It was year 3 under head coach Mike Rhodes. We'll talk about what the heck happened because Daniel Gowan followed every step of the way, all the way from preseason camp through the Big Ten tournament of this basketball season. And we'll also discuss what happens next with the roster, some key roster retention pieces that they want to sustain on campus and build with, and how do they go out and kind of right the ship here, and how hot is that seat for Rhodes as he finishes season 3 as Penn State basketball leader. We will talk about that in a moment, but as I said, we'll circle back now to the Penn State football squad. We are closing in 12 days away from Penn State football getting back on the practice field. First practice session under new head coach Matt Campbell and his group of coordinators and assistants. And as I said, we're going to learn a lot about this group once we see them in some competitive drills and hopefully some 11-on-11 action as things progress. But we have been digging around, whether it's conversations with players directly or members of this new staff, about who is stepping up, who has impressed so far. And Tyler, we're going to reference a piece that you posted during my vacation and our time away from the podcast a bit here, because you brought some of those names into the spotlight that we hadn't necessarily discussed a lot in the pod. And we'll begin with a defensive back who came down from a school that you covered before you covered Penn State, Boston College, Omarion Davis, a safety, and it is a revamped safety room. I don't know how much we've referenced Davis other than maybe mentioning that he signed with the team back in January. So take it away and kind of set the tone for us, because we're going to dig a little bit deeper into some of these position groups today.
Yeah, we focused so much on the Iowa State safety transfers that came over. Omarion Davis kind of flew under the radar a little bit, but he's not flying under the radar in State College. That staff really likes him. Deion Broomfield wanted to get him on board. He's got multiple years of eligibility remaining. He's coming off his true freshman season at Boston College, and he took his lumps in year 1 at BC. You know, he was thrust into probably a bigger than expected role on the back end of the secondary. There were some highs, there were some lows, but I think that's what you come to expect of a true freshman who's taking on, or maybe even biting off more than he can chew in year 1. But Davis, his development, it's on a fast track. He's doing a lot of the right things behind the scenes. There are a lot of people who are excited to see what this kid is all about when he gets into pads, when spring ball kicks off. So a lot of excitement about Omarion Davis. He's a versatile safety, so he fits in that regard. Good cover guy. Again, the guy Deion Broomfield really wanted to get in the portal, and they locked him down day 1 on campus during his visit. They made sure he did not leave State College without committing, and they were happy to get him signed, and it sounded like that is already paying off.
Tyler, last season we saw Penn State use 4 different safeties. Zeki Wheatley pretty much never left the field, but it was almost a week-to-week basis for a while about whether the starting job would go to Antoine Belgrave-Shorter or Dejan Lane or King Mack. Ultimately, Mack played the most out of those 3, but it was really a 4-man approach at safety. As we start to see this depth chart constructed and Deion Broomfield gets these guys back on the field this spring, do you anticipate that maybe number sticking for this safety group, or maybe even expanding given what they brought in, what they're familiar with, and the early impression of Davis?
Yeah, there's a lot of talent in the room for sure. You talk about Marcus Neal, Jeremiah Cooper, Jameson Patton, 3 Iowa State transfers. Hunter Sewell, he's a little bit younger. He's another Iowa State transfer. I wouldn't expect him to factor into the equation this year. But those 3 guys, Davis, plus what Penn State returns at the position, I think you're going to see Broomfield kind of rotate through those bodies and get the most out of that group. I don't think you're going to see any single guy overworked. I think you're going to see a lot of guys plugged into different spots in the defense, because a bunch of these guys offer positional versatility. You know, they're not just playing safety. Some could play nickel corner for you. Some could work as that one high safety if need be. So there's a versatility skill set wise in this safety room that I think the Penn State staff is really, really excited about. Davis kind of fits that mold because, like I said, he could play down around the line of scrimmage if you need him to. It's something that he did throughout his high school career in South Carolina. It's something he did a little bit at Boston College, not quite as much. But again, I think that was more a matter of the staff trying to put as little on his plate as possible, not trying to overload him in year one. Now he's at year two. He's in a new defense. It's a fresh start for him, but he's got that year of collegiate experience under his belt. And I think that's helping him greatly throughout this winter workout session. I think it's going to parlay that into success on the field during spring practice. But yeah, it's a deep safety room. I think you're going to see all of these guys make an impact to some degree in this first season of Deion Broomfield heading up that position group. Davis, though, he's generating a lot of buzz. I'm very excited to see what he's going to do.
Yeah, Marcus Neal has been the guy that's been labeled perhaps the biggest pickup for them here on defense from the transfer portal. A really strong career at Iowa State. We'll see what he does with Penn State. But it is a deeper group. And Daniel, to that point, a guy that I think has gone a bit under the radar in terms of roster attention, and he's going to be part of that safety conversation, is Vabu Torre, now redshirt sophomore. We got a pretty extended look at him in the Pinstripe Bowl. He was that fifth safety, I think you would probably describe him as, for much of the season, which meant not a lot of game action on defense at least, but really carried that reputation as an intimidating presence in the backfield to campus coming out of high school. And the development has been intriguing to watch. And I thought that his retention on the roster spoke a bit about what this new staff may have seen from him on film and heard from him behind the scenes. I know Alan Zamitis was a big fan of Vabu Torre coming to campus. He remains an integral part of the personnel approach here at Penn State. What is your impression of Torre so far as he tries to make his move in that room?
Yeah, I mean, I think he'll have an opportunity moving forward. And I think that when you talk about the versatility that Deion Broomfield and this staff coming in that they value in the secondary, I think that you can find a home for Torre and, maybe a different package, different situations, things like that. I think the retention of Torre and, going off of adding Omarion Davis, looking at Ivan McDaniel's addition as well, I think it speaks to wanting to maintain some sustainability within the roster as you move forward. Because, Jeremiah Cooper is a redshirt senior, Jamison Patton is a senior, Marcus Neal is a junior, but he's a very, very good player. So, will he use the 2 years, available to him, at Penn State? But then you look at, Torre, Davis, McDaniels, they all have 3 years of eligibility remaining. And then underneath that, you have another layer of these freshmen who came in, Askew and Bryson Williams. So I think that Torre, there should be opportunities for him on the field. I think he's proven it on special teams over the past couple of years. But retaining him and making some of these other additions, I think it speaks to this staff coming in and, having 2026 in mind, but also thinking about 27, 28 as you move forward with these younger players that they either added or retained.
Torre got 50 snaps in non-conference play last year, about 10 snaps in Big Ten action last season, and then played 30 snaps against Clemson in the Pinstripe Bowl. So an interesting blend of use for Torre. Hardly saw him in conference work, except for special teams, and we'll see if he can grow his role. A guy I wanted to get to from that Iowa State transfer group, and it's 24 players who already have been with the Cyclones and been with Matt Campbell on a different campus. Guy that we haven't discussed a ton about, Tyler, that you referenced in your piece, and we're going to talk to you about right now, is Ike Ezeagu. He's shed some weight. He's going to be a defensive end. That's where he's listed on the roster. I know last year was around 285 to 290 pounds. We had some questions. How does he fit on this defensive line? We kind of got the answer of what a defensive tackle looks like on this new defense with all the big bodies they brought in. And there's not really hardly anyone who's under 305, 310 in that defensive tackle group. So on the edge, not that springy, twitchy edge rusher, the lean built guy that we've come to expect here at Penn State, more of a big bodied figure. Tell us what you're hearing about Ezeagu and his development so far with the staff he's familiar with, although this is a different defensive line coach and a different edge rushers coach than they had at Iowa State.
He's down about 10 pounds. He's in that 275 range right now. He thought about getting down to around 270, 265, a little bit light for his liking. It's not necessarily a weight that he can feel comfortable playing at. So 275 seems to be that sweet spot for Ike Ezeagu. And I like the makeup here. I think just given what Penn State wants to do up front with its defensive linemen, with its defensive ends in specific, there's more of a place for those bigger defensive end types than we've seen in recent years. You see it in recruiting with some of the defensive ends they're going after, and you see it with some of the defensive ends that they brought in the portal, because Alexander McPherson is another guy that kind of fits that mold. He's a little bit bigger. But with Eziogu, he has done a great job behind the scenes. Veteran who knows this group that came over from Iowa State really, really well when it comes to the coaches and the player personnel that came over. But he's hit the ground running, building relationships with a guy like Malloy, building relationship with Christian Smith. He's developed kind of a leadership role in that locker room among the defensive linemen already. So one of those guys internally, a lot of excitement about not just what he could bring to the table on the field. That D end is a bigger D end in this system, but off the field as well. He's one of those veterans who has served as a bridge for those who weren't familiar with this group, Matt Campbell and all those guys coming over from Iowa State, those who stuck around at Penn State. He has helped in that regard. Just one of those glue guy types, intangibles you really, really like. And he's definitely going to make an on-field impact for Penn State in 2026. He feels like he's got some unfinished business in the collegiate ranks, and he's looking to get that done in Happy Valley.
Redshirt senior is Eziogu, and big thanks to the whoever maintained that Iowa State roster and added all the pronunciations to that roster. Yeah. We can maybe use some carryover with Penn State and how they kind of set things up there. But Ike Eziogu, a name that you're going to see on paper and struggle to pronounce, but hopefully we can help you through that here on the podcast. And he is somebody that last year as a redshirt junior started every game for Iowa State, career best 25 tackles. The production doesn't really jump out at you. 3 of those for loss. He had 1 sack, but he did lead the Cyclones with 7 quarterback hurries. And he's going to be important because this is a defensive end room that was largely gutted by transfer departures. We have a couple guys to get to in a moment, but of course you lose a really promising pass rusher in Chaz Coleman down at Tennessee. Zariah Fisher kind of surprised us, taking his 7th year out at USC, and then Denai Dennis Sutton trying to work his way up 2026 NFL draft boards. And so that leaves a lot of focus on 2 younger members of the roster, and certainly young for Max Granville, who's year 3 in terms of his production because he wasn't involved at all last year. But Daniel, Granville as a redshirt sophomore coming off of an injury, and then Yvonne Kamaju coming off a really strong freshman year. He seemed to get better and better as things progressed. Terry Smith as interim coach really started to open things up for him in terms of involvement. We saw him take advantage of that. And both of them in their own ways have earned some praise from the new staff through winter conditioning, which is great to hear regarding Max Granville. I know they feel like they're going to have to be smart with him in spring ball, but they think now, almost a full calendar year removed from his injury in the offseason last May, that he is ready to put in some serious work and maybe live up to those lofty expectations that he came to campus with after reclassifying from the 2025 class to the 2024 class.
Yeah, I think there should be a lot of excitement about Granville, moving forward. It's kind of like a fits and starts thing, for him with his career because, it's suddenly he reclassifies late that summer, gets to campus, and then, seems poised for, a big jump last year, has a setback, is sidelined. Now he's going to get, the chance to make that jump finally. And I think that he's one of those guys that, based on our conversations with him and, the feedback that we got from Deion Barnes and James Franklin when they were here, that he's wired the right way, that there was a reason why that they, felt comfortable having him, reclassify. I don't think he came in. I think he came in at what a normal freshman age would be, when he did reclassify. So he didn't get to campus particularly young. But I think that being in your 3rd year, having an element of maturity, the intangibles, seem like they're off the charts. He was ready, during that college football playoff run when there was some question about Abdul Carter and whether Granville would have to step up in that role in the Orange Bowl. Like, talking to him, he seemed very composed, very ready. He understood, I think, the significance of that. So I think that, he's wired the right way, and it'll just be a question of, what does it look like physically when he gets onto the field. I liked what we saw in the little bit in 2024. That's a long time ago now. New scheme, new coaches, a whole lot is different. But I think that there's going to be a lot of excitement and, attention around him because his retention seemed pretty big because, he was on the younger side. we know what Deion Barnes means to these players. Obviously we know what James Franklin means to these players. He was someone that took that leap and trust in the staff by reclassifying. And for him to look at Matt Campbell and, this landscape at Penn State and say, yeah, this is where I want to be. I think that's pretty significant. One last thing on Ezeagu. I think seeing him at Thon, he's a eye test guy for sure. When you think about how long he is, how big he is, I think it's very, very impressive. Also wearing number 88 as a defensive lineman, defensive end. I think that's a fun look. So I'm excited to see him on the field when we get the chance to.
Let's flip over to the other side of the trenches. We've talked about the offensive tackle spot a lot this offseason here on the podcast. We addressed it a little bit earlier this week when we discussed Anthony Donko being sidelined for spring ball, and that maybe opening the door for a guy like Garrett Sexton, who's a redshirt sophomore. But let's talk about a trio of redshirt freshmen with you, Tyler Calvaruso. I bring up Malachi Goodman because I feel like I continue to need to do that. I think he's very much going to be in the contention to be a left tackle, first team or second team for this Penn State squad, coming off of a five-star signing as a member of that 2025 class. Did not play a down of football in game action last year. But again, his athleticism is very impressive. And the mindset that we've heard about this offseason also coupled with it. You'd like that combination and that working for Malachi Goodman as he gets back on the field under a new offensive line coach, Ryan Clanton. But two guys that you referenced in your piece, also in their second year at the college level, Owen Alasine, who was with this program last year, got some work in the season opener, didn't play in the remaining 12 matchups. And then Kowal, who spent his first year with Iowa State and did not see any game work. And him and Will Tompkins both make the move as second-year offensive tackles from Ames. But you had Kowal and Alasine in your spotlight for that recent piece at Lions247.com. Why don't you tell us why?
Yeah, Alasine been bouncing back and forth, left tackle, right tackle. He's got that kind of versatility where he could compete for multiple spots on the offensive line. He's in the process of transforming his body. I think that's been an ongoing process since he arrived on campus from Avon Old Farms as a true freshman. We've said it a bunch of times, former hockey player. So he's walking that line of adding good weight while maintaining the agility and athleticism that made him such an intriguing prospect coming out of high school. I think he's done a pretty good job of that. He's trying to be around 310 when spring ball begins. I think he's inching very, very close to that at this point. And he's in a spot where he's kind of like Goodman, where you have to factor him into any conversation when it comes to guys competing for playing time at the tackle spot or anywhere on the offensive line. He's got the goods to make an impact in 2026. Where exactly that potential impact could take place, either tackle spot, it's something that he feels comfortable doing. If he gets asked to play left, he can play on the left side of the line. If he gets asked to play right, he's good playing on the right side of the line. He did a little bit of both in the high school ranks as well. So that's something he's familiar with. Kowal, I think he's a little bit further off than the other two, but that's not a bad thing. This Penn State staff is very optimistic about his upside and his ability to reach that high ceiling when it's all said and done. Impressive athlete. He was one of the more underrated pieces, I think, that came over from Iowa State in the offseason because we focus so much on the veterans and so much on the guys who could contribute right away. Kowal is the makings of a potential future starting offensive lineman at Penn State. I think he's in that mold of an athletic tackle who's still in the process of adding the requisite upper body mass while maintaining everything that made him a four-star prospect from an athleticism and agility standpoint. But he's getting better and better by the day. That's been the feedback internally. And again, the excitement that this staff had for Kowal when they signed him at Iowa State remains very much in place now that he's in State College.
Every time I bring up the name Brock Riker, I feel like I have to turn over toward Dominic Rulli and say, he's still here. He's fighting. They like what they're getting out of Dominic Rulli as a fifth-year senior. But there's a reason that Brock Riker became a very coveted commodity in the transfer portal this past winter. A year of starting experience at Texas State. It's a lower rung of the ladder in college football, but that was his first game experience at center. It's not something that he did throughout his high school career. And all he did was become a freshman All-American at that position. And he was outstanding as a pass blocker. He was really held his own as a run blocker. And you consider that he played last season around 275. Right now, he's pushing toward 290. Feels like he can get to 300 probably by the time the season rolls around. I sat down with Brock Riker a couple of weeks ago and was really impressed by just how much this was a step up for him and just how much he has embraced it, because going from Texas State and the facilities they had, the athletes that were around him that he was competing against and with, this is just a different world. It's a different beast. But Penn State was not alone in thinking that he belonged at the top tier of college football. SEC, Big Ten programs were circling around this guy. Schools out west, plenty of teams wanted him on their roster this year. Penn State was particularly proactive, getting him to campus. They were able to kind of shut things down with him relatively early in the process before he went out and about and expanded his horizons. And I just think the way that we've heard him described by some members of the coaching staff so far, some members of this locker room so far, lead me to believe that this is going to be a hit. And what I love about this is even if he doesn't necessarily outright beat Dominic Rulli for the center job going into the season opener in non-conference play, I still think there's an opportunity for him to get work in non-conference action. And a reminder that while Rulli is a senior this year, and this is his final rodeo as a college football offensive lineman, sophomore status for Brock Reicher. So you're getting 3 seasons potentially at the center position with a guy who's proven he can do it at the Division I level and has already shown that he has the physical makeup to build his body out. He is still relatively lean above the waist. And again, he's put on 10, 15 pounds since he arrived on campus. There's room for growth there. Muscle mass, a little bit of fat will be okay for this guy. And I'm telling you, the trunk of him is already where it needs to be. Tells you a lot about where he is as a physical specimen. So I think Brock Reicher's worth mentioning on the offensive line too. And a little bit more of a sexier, splashier conversation now. We'll go to you, Daniel, and the master of sexy conversations, Kobe Howard. He's a name that was buzzing all year long last year. It was a positive buzz for a while. Then it was a negative buzz because it was like, why the hell isn't James Franklin playing this dude? Finally, he gets involved during the second half of the season, makes some field stretching plays, shows some of that potential, and he was a really important roster retention piece for Penn State. They bring in 7 new receivers, 2 of them freshmen, 5 of them transfers. But Kobe Howard is the guy who stuck around that people are kind of gravitating toward. No disrespect to Lyric Samuel or Peter Gonzalez, but they have plenty to prove on the field, particularly in game action. So when we are hearing that, yeah, the trajectory has sustained here in year 2, should be a strong spring practice for Kobe Howard. And by the way, Daniel, you mentioned earlier this week that both Chase Sowell and Brett Eskelson, who were starters for Iowa State last year, may be dealing with some bumps and bruises, getting back on track. So I'd imagine there's a lot of opportunity for Kobe Howard in the weeks ahead here on the spring ball field. What's your reaction to that sustained momentum in a positive direction and what he could mean for Penn State in 2026?
I don't really think it's a surprise to hear that based on what we heard about Kobe Howard last year and how he carried himself. I believe we talked to him once, during the season, and then I think he was available, a couple of weeks ago, when we talked to the players. I think that he's someone who's, really confident. I think those Florida guys, they've already pretty much seen everything in terms of competition when they get to college, the way the game is played down there. And I think that, he came in and, knew what he needed to do. And I think that over the course of last year, he was doing what was asked from him and got better. When we talked to Noah Pauly at the beginning of February, the one thing that he said about Kobe Howard that, really stood out was the competitive streak that he had and the approach that he had to everything. That was something that, Noah Pauly talked about, that this Iowa State staff, they watched the game film from last year, but a lot of these guys that came back don't have a lot of game film. And so they were watching all of the practice film, from last year. And they were looking at, all right, what does this guy look like on a Wednesday in November, as opposed to, maybe a Saturday, what did he look like early in the year? And from what Noah Pauly said, they had a really, really good impression of Kobe Howard and what he was about. I also think the Kobe Howard retention was, good for I think we all think he's going to be a good player, but I think that was also a big PR win, for this staff, just because he was just so buzzed about last year. It was, every week, like, are we going to see this guy? Are we going to see him? Like, what can he do? And to get him to, come back, stick around, and maybe actually get the chance to show that on a consistent basis. I think that's a way, that the staff, built some goodwill there. Of course, it's March now. What's this going to look like in September, October, November, January? If we get there. But I think that having Kobe Howard back, I think is significant. And, it's going to be some good competition in that room, I think.
Yeah, and going back to really Keandre Labert-Smith, Parker Washington, a big issue for this receiver room has been developing homegrown talent that's making an impact on the field. It's been trying to plug and play different transfer pieces, and it's worked sometimes. It has failed miserably at others. But Kobe Howard showed you some of those goods after getting just a handful of snaps through the first half of season before James Franklin was fired. He had a 26-yard catch against Ohio State. He had a 22-yard catch against Indiana. He had a 31-yard catch against Nebraska. He had 2 catches for 34 yards against Clemson. Small sample size, but he averaged 19 yards per reception during his opportunities to get the ball as a true freshman. And now we see what awaits in sophomore year. I think when you look across the board, though, this is probably the guy on offense, at least, that probably carries the most buzz among guys who return from the roster. You're going to see a lot of new pieces on offense. It's an offensive coordinator who came over from Iowa State. He's got a lot of the same toys, but Kobe Howard's a new one, and I think we're all really intrigued by what comes next for him. Going over to tight end, it's a spot where we've discussed it before. You're going to be down some veterans, guys who are going to play a bunch, because in spring ball, Gabe Burkle is not available. He's recovering from a knee injury that he suffered last year. Really an important piece for Iowa State at tight end in 2025. And then Andrew Rappleyea, we know how important he was for Penn State, especially down the stretch last year, playing a ton of football, catching touchdowns in the last 3 matchups. He's going to miss spring ball with his own injury. And so while you have Benjamin Bramer warranting the spotlight after an all Big 12 season last year, it leaves the door open for other guys to make their move. And Tyler, someone you wanted to make sure that we discussed here was Brian Kordovich, and he's probably the tight end I would say we've discussed the least this winter, this early spring now. And tell us what Kordovich has accomplished with the new staff and why you think he's someone who could make some noise in the months ahead.
He's a Taylor Mauser tight end. He's tough. He blocks. He can make an impact as a receiver. He does all the little things that if you look back at some of the tight ends Mauser coached up at Iowa State, guys who have either achieved collegiate success or have gone on to the NFL and done well for themselves, like Charlie Kohler just signed a pretty nice deal in free agency, and that was one of Mauser's proteges. So you've seen guys with skill sets that mirror Kordovich's a little bit go on and achieve some level of success, whether it be in the Big 12 or in the NFL. And look, he's a young guy. There are names ahead of him on the depth chart. They're going to be named ahead of him on the depth chart throughout the year. That's kind of just the reality of that tight end room. It's a talented one. But Kordovich, he's a workout guy. He puts his head down and he grinds. So the fact that his name has come up in conversation as someone who was impressed throughout the offseason really does not surprise me in the slightest. And I think he's a dude who can make some waves once spring ball begins. Again, the skill set, the versatility, it allows him to play in multiple different personnel packages for you. He's a multifaceted tight end, and he can do a lot of things well. He's kind of a jack of all trades in that regard. Still has developing to do, I think, in each area. But again, he's a young guy. He's going to get there. At least there's internal confidence that he's going to get there. And it was another underrated one, but he was one Penn State really, really wanted to keep around because they like what they see out of him long term. I believe this group had a little bit of familiarity with him from the high school recruitment as well. You know, he was in Ohio. The staff has a lot of ties in the Midwest. That's a program that staff recruited in the past. And Kordovich was a guy who consistently came up as just one of those tough as nails, grinder tight ends. And that's what he's going to be at Penn State, and the staff likes that.
Kordovich, 6'4", 250 on the roster. He's a redshirt freshman. I know Daniel pointed him out a few times on the practice field and just said he really well put together for a first-year tight end. And that tight end room is a lot of big bodies last year. So you noticed him among that group. And I don't blame you out there for our listeners or viewers if you didn't quite notice him joining the roster, because he was kind of lost in the shuffle of that late Andrew Olish pursuit. And, of course, Olish came on board as one of the top tight end recruits in the country last year. Never entered a Nittany Lion game and went off to Oregon. And so now Kordovich, the final remaining member of that 2025 tight end class, which initially had 3, Matt Henderson went down to Virginia Tech, followed Ty Howell and James Franklin of Blacksburg. And another name that we'll get to on offense here, we got a few more. James Peoples, running back who spent his first couple of seasons with Ohio State, was a backup for them, and it's obviously a running back situation that changed fast last year because you had Bo Jackson come to campus and prove that he could be a bit of a bell cow as a true freshman. I think that they were surprised by that development in Columbus, and yet here we are. James Peoples, it's funny to say that he's one of those names that's beyond the headlines because he's one of the top running back recruits in that 2024 recruiting class, which also included Quentin Martin Jr. here at Penn State. But the reality is there is a lot of intrigue about Martin, what he can do coming off a 100-yard rushing performance in the Pinstripe Bowl. He was a Penn State target throughout his high school career here in the state of Pennsylvania. And then on top of that, you add Carson Hansen, who was nearly a 1,000-yard rusher for Iowa State last year. Final 4 or 5 games of the season in 2025, he's going 100-plus rushing yards, 21 touchdowns the last couple of years with the Cyclones. And so you're wondering, okay, with this staff, are they just going to be comfortable to lean on this guy, working Quentin Martin? And yet very much what we have heard is this could turn out to be a 1-2 punch with Hansen and Peoples, and then Quentin Martin really having the opportunity to carve out his own role. He's an exceptional receiver at the running back position. He's added some speed. He's added some weight. He's a wild card, but I think James Peoples is somebody that Ohio State in a perfect world would have kept, but they only have so much money to go around, and they've only got so many carries to go around with Bo Jackson returning as a sophomore. And Daniel, James Peoples could make a lot of noise in a hurry. I wouldn't be surprised if by the time we get into Big Ten action, people are paying more attention to this guy because he did some special things in non-conference play.
It's kind of funny with Peoples because he was within one spot of Quentin Martin in those class of 2024 running back rankings. And he comes in, he's same age as Quentin Martin, comes in. And I think that in my mind, it's like, okay, they brought in like a veteran, who has all this experience. And then with Quentin Martin, it's like, he's still a young guy who's ascending and whatnot. But that just goes to the fact that James Peoples got to play over his first 2 years in college and Quentin Martin did not. For myriad reasons. I think the Peoples edition is, pretty interesting. And I think that he's one of these guys that it's okay. Like when you bring him in and you put him in a different role, what does it look like? How does that change things for him? I'm pretty intrigued by him. We talked about it before the show. Penn State put this winter workouts video, on social media, and someone on our board, took, I think, the screenshot of him, or they said, Nick, who's number 23 in there? And, you look in, we're all learning these new faces and like, oh, that's James Peoples. And he looked pretty big, pretty well put together, which I think you would expect. Someone who was a high profile prospect got to spend 2 years at a top program in Ohio State. So I'm really curious what it looks like when he gets on the field. I think also like supplemental to that, I think I saw him at maybe one hockey game, maybe two. I think that he's been around campus. We've talked about, these players, being out more, the staff being out more. I was at a women's hockey game last Saturday and Taylor Mauser was there just in the stands with his family, not in the suite, not away. He was just, hanging out. And, seeing James Peoples out and about, I was kind of like, oh, like that's a little different. That's something a little bit new. So I think that he's going to be someone that, we'll learn more about, see what kind of role that he fits in. And I'm curious what it looks like how Penn State, manages this running back rotation, because Carson Hansen, was a little bit of a bell cow. Also Iowa State didn't bring the other running back that got some work last year, Abu Sama. I believe he's at Wisconsin. Don't quote me on that. And so to come in and have someone like Peoples, it might be a little bit of a different approach. So I'm curious how that comes together for Penn State over the course of camp, and maybe non-conference play really gives us the sampling of how this is really going to look.
Let's close this conversation with focus on a couple of true freshmen, and we always got to be careful getting out in front of our skis when it comes to first-year college players. We've seen it before where there's some off-season buzz, and then you get to the season and they're kind of tucked away, and we see them in a scout team uniform. But a couple guys, Tyler, that you noted in your piece that have turned heads with their work ethic, with their early development on campus from both sides of the ball. Defensive end Jackson Ford, who will remind folks was the only commit from the Franklin era who stuck on board afterwards and signed. You had Peyton Falzone ultimately circle back and sign, but when James Franklin was fired as Penn State's head coach, Falzone was committed to Auburn. And so Jackson Ford's the only one who weathered that storm and signed with the program in December, joined the team in January, and then the local kid, Deontay Sheffy. And I have a feeling that if James Franklin's staff had offered him early in the process, he would have been on board a long time ago. Instead, never picked up that scholarship offer from Penn State. They had Messiah Minkins on board. He goes down to Virginia Tech. And Deontay Sheffy, a former Syracuse commit, gets a late opportunity from the new Penn State staff, jumps on it. And after a highly productive career that did feature a trip over to Harrisburg for his junior season, he comes in and he has turned heads. And this is a running back room that, as we've kind of laid out, isn't built right now, if guys are healthy, to kind of support a freshman ascension, for a freshman to crash that party and command 10 plus snaps a game. But tell us what you're hearing about Sheffy, and then across the field at defensive end, Jackson Ford.
Yeah, I don't think anyone is necessarily expecting anything out of these guys in year one, but they've done a lot of right things behind the scenes since they arrived on campus as early enrollees. Really put their head down, got to work in the weight room, got adjusted to college life really, really well, because that's a battle for some of these early enrollees. Not everyone adjusts the same way. You know, for some guys, it's tougher than others. But Ford and Sheffy, they've approached things very professionally. They've done everything asked of them and then some. So I think in checking in on this early group, it's so early to determine returns. I mean, we're not even at spring ball yet. But workout-wise, intangible-wise, everything that's gone on behind the scenes inside of Lash since January, since this early enrollee group arrived in town, Sheffy and Ford have consistently come up as standout guys to keep an eye on moving forward. And Sheffy skill set-wise, I mean, we'll see it more during spring ball, but he'll never blow you away physically or athletically, but he's a smart, solid runner. And Ford, I mean, he's really hit the ground running in the weight room. He's the main one. I mean, he's up around probably tacked on about 15 plus pounds of muscle, which, I mean, look, he's got a ways to go in his development. I think we knew that coming in, but there's a lot of optimism that he's going to be able to get there. Big recruiting win for Penn State last cycle in a multitude of ways. It was a big one originally, beating out some of the programs they beat out and then hanging on to him through it all, because he had options to go elsewhere after James Franklin's firing. It didn't. He stuck it out when nobody knew what direction Penn State was going to go at head coach, as we've talked about a bunch with Jackson Ford. So two guys who could be foundational pieces in that 26 class. We'll see how things ultimately play out for them long term, but short term, it's been solid. It's been a good start for them.
A couple of notes here as we got a roster update this week, and Daniel did a great job of breaking things down for New Jersey numbers and all that sorts of stuff over at Lions247.com on Wednesday. But we got some clarity earlier this week about two different players at new positions, or at least new positions based on where we thought they might be on the field. Caleb Brewer, who spent his first couple of years here as an offensive guard on scout team work, really. He is now working at defensive tackle. It was an intriguing prospect out of Wyomissing, the same place you saw Javen Williams come out of a year before Brewer. Brewer has come to campus, and I haven't really gotten a chance to see much of him, but he was at all those prospect camps, and I know that the three of us had discussed in live time, is this guy a defensive lineman? Is he an offensive lineman? And as it turns out, he's going to be both for the Nittany Lions after playing offense, now shifting inside. He's at about 302 pounds. That's where he's listed. He's been as heavy as 312 here at Penn State. He checked in on campus right around 285. So development to watch here, not necessarily for 2026, I would say, but probably moving forward as you try to keep that defensive tackle group healthy and developing. He's a redshirt sophomore. And then Amarian Jackson, early word we got on the freshman who followed a lot of those other Iowa State signings over here. We heard that he was going to probably play safety to start his career. They introduced him as an athlete. That's where he was still listed on the roster. He's focused on wide receiver, and he's got quite a track record there. 3,300 career receiving yards in high school out in Nebraska. 40 touchdown receptions, and he was catching passes from an Alabama quarterback recruit who was actually committed to Iowa State for some time as well. So just a couple notes there on the roster before we shift over to basketball and potentially lose some of this audience. Let's do that, though, because basketball season is over. And I know some people have brought up the word mercy that it is done, and I don't know how you feel about that, Daniel, but season finishes with a loss in the opener for them against Northwestern in the Big Ten tournament. We heard Mike Rhodes say they wanted to try to make a little bit of noise there. They kept it close. It wasn't one of those games where they're down 25 at halftime, but you saw a lot of those this year. What the heck happened, man?
Yeah, it was definitely a tough one for Penn State this year. That 76-66 loss to Northwestern on Tuesday in the Big Ten tournament. That was their 13th loss by double digits this season. 20 losses this year. It's the first time they lost 20 games since Pat Chambers' second year in 2012-2013. The 17 conference losses is the most in program history. I know that you can fudge that a little bit because they're playing 20 games. Like, they didn't always play 20 games, but I think that that's still a number that stands out, having that last place finish. And then overall, there are just stretches of being non-competitive, 4 30-point losses this year. I think 7 20-point losses, a pretty high number. And then, over the course, like I think there were, maybe 7 or 8 games this year where they were just down by, 20 at halftime or 18 at halftime. But yeah, I mean, Mike Rhodes, I think the key themes that he always hit on was that this was a young team. This was an inexperienced team. And you're playing in the Big Ten where everyone is older, bigger, more physically developed, they're stronger, and that really made things difficult for Penn State. And I think you saw that over the course of the game, over the course of the season with, some of these droughts that the team would go through, as a young team. I think in that loss to Rutgers on Sunday to close the regular season, they had a 5-minute, 35-second stretch of scoreless play in the first half and a 6-minute, 5-second stretch of scoreless play in the first half. And that was just a key theme over the course of the season. And I think that, it's the thing, it's one thing to lose. It's another thing to lose in such discouraging fashion. So it's going to be an interesting offseason. But I think that it's a season that a lot of people are going to want to flush pretty quickly.
I don't know how many people are aware of this, Tyler, but you've got a lot of chops in the college basketball world too. You covered it. You went to a school that is fixated on success in the basketball court in Seton Hall. That's what they do over there. That's what they focus on. No offense to the football program that doesn't exist over there. But when you look at this Penn State team, I know you were pretty plugged in along the way, keeping tabs on the roster building last offseason. What would you point to as maybe the top 2 or 3 factors that led to such a dismal result?
I think Mike Rhodes just touched on it. You got to get older to play in the Big Ten these days. You've got to have experience. You've got to be able to bang in that conference. And this year's team was just a lot of young guys that took their lumps. And I think they'll be better off in year 2. I think year 1, they learned a lot in many cases about what this conference truly is. And you've got to build a roster that kind of supplements that. You could have youth in today's college basketball world. That's still fine. But you've got to have veteran pieces that can contribute. And Penn State had Freddie DeLeon do that. But needed more. Wasn't quite there. Some of these games, I mean, Daniel said it, they just weren't competitive by any stretch. I mean, it was a really, really tough year on all fronts. There were some close calls, some games that, could have went one way for Penn State, but a few bounces didn't go their way. There were others where they took the court and it was uncompetitive from the start. I think those ups and downs, that level of difference, just that comes along with a really young team. So it's a pivotal offseason, right? I mean, it's going to be a tough sell in the portal between the financial hamstrings that the program deals with and the lack of recent success. Getting guys to State College, it might not be easy, but this is a staff that prides itself on finding the right guys in the portal, guys who truly fit what Penn State is trying to accomplish in spite of those financial hamstrings that the program faces. So we'll see once the portal opens. As we're going to talk about now, it's about retention. Portal opens on April 7th. There are several key pieces. Look, I know I don't want to say crapped on the youth, but we all saw the product on the court. Some guys need to continue to grow. They need to develop. But there are still several pieces that this staff wants to keep around. And there are several pieces that are important for this staff to keep around.
Before we talk about the pieces, let's talk about the man who is ultimately implementing them, and that is Mike Rhodes. He's now through 3 years as head coach at Penn State. Remember, at VCU before he came to Happy Valley, 3 appearances in the NCAA tournament, including his last season there, 2022-23. They were the Atlantic 10 champions that year. He brings over a significant chunk of his roster, including Ace Baldwin, defensive standout, point guard, guy who was the face of this early era for Mike Rhodes. They go 16-17 in year 1. They win 9 Big Ten games. They seem to be a team that by the end of that process was moving in the right direction. They retain pieces, Ace Baldwin among them, familiarity. You guys are talking about a lack of veterans. They had veterans a season ago, right? And yet they seem to take a step back. They went from 9 wins in the Big Ten to 6 wins in the Big Ten. And Daniel, when you add what we just witnessed this year, where you're down to 3 wins in conference play and 12-20 overall, it's hard to ignore where kind of, the line is going if you're following the stock market. So in your opinion, how hot is the seat under Mike Rhoades as he enters year 4, assuming this remains his job? And how do you think that could impact their ability to acquire and retain talent?
Yeah, I think that this year, I do think that down the stretch, Rhoades was carrying himself like someone who knew that he would be back. I think that there was a little bit of a quiet confidence, very forward looking, the way that he was talking. We did ask him after the Ohio State game about last week about what he thought about his future and whether he thought he would be back. And I think he seemed a little incredulous that those questions were popping up. But I mean, it was a 32-point loss on senior night, coming off a nice win against Iowa. So I think that it was bad enough to warrant those questions. But and then I think another thing that you have to talk about is, I know that last year we learned that a lot of money can appear to pay off contracts when you really want to make it happen. But I think that the way that Rhoades' contract was structured is that this year it would have just been really prohibitive to pay off that contract if you wanted to move off of him. Then you factor in having to hire a new coach, new staff. I don't really think that would have been a prudent financial investment, especially with the resources that are given to this program. But yeah, I mean, you see some of these. I think college basketball has a infrastructure on social media. I think infrastructure is the right word, of a lot of these gossip accounts that are legitimately plugged in. And I think you saw Rhoades' name on the coach tiers as like hot seat next year. And I think that that's what a lot of people were looking at, that, okay, like what will it look like next year? Because you had all these young players, tough lift in the Big Ten. How are you going to do that moving forward? Now, I also think that retaining Rhoades is key for player retention.
Yeah.
I think someone like Caden Mingo, I think that if you were to move on from, like, I saw someone on social media was like, yeah, they should keep Mingo and Ivan Juric, but get rid of Mike Rhoades. And it's like, well, that's not really how these things work.
Not how it works.
And so I think that having Rhoades, increases the likelihood that these young pieces stick around. Obviously, you're going to have to be competitive. I think that there's going to be a lot of people sniffing around some of these players, especially Mingo and Juric, just because of what they showed. But I think also retaining Rhoades is like, the way that he wants to build this program is very linearly. I think that you saw that with the guys that he brought from VCU and Nick Kern and Ace Baldwin, where they had been with him for 3-4 years, and that it was really building towards a point. And I think that that's what he wants to do with these young players, is that he wants to keep developing them. He wants to keep building them. And I think that if they can keep a core together, these young players, and then supplement it, I think that you can see the trajectory there. It's just a question of, will you be competitive enough to supplement those guys? Will you be competitive enough to keep them? He told us a couple of weeks ago that he thinks that he believes they will have the resources to be competitive, but we'll see.
Yeah. Something worth noting here as they go and fill out this roster and try to have a successful offseason. John Sauber from the Center Daily Times reported last week that Calvin Booth, former Denver Nuggets general manager who helped piece together an NBA championship team there in Denver, and obviously a former Nittany Lions basketball standout who remains the all-time leader for blocks with this program, is going to be helping in a consultant kind of fashion with roster building. So helping, whether it's recruiting, maybe analyzing some of these talent players in the transfer portal. He's got some kind of role back here with the program, which I know a lot of people will probably welcome a name from the past there in Booth. But when it comes to the to-do list, Tyler, you kind of laid it out with the story at Lions247.com on Wednesday. Who's at the top? Who are the names that you say, let's start here and then we'll work from there?
It's Caden Mingo, Ivan Juric, then I'd say essentially everyone else. Those are definitely the two most important keeps. Daniel did a good job kind of outlining that there's going to be a market for both of those guys, especially Mingo, because, look, the heavy hitters in college basketball, they will pay for high-level guard play. They will. because that's just probably the most coveted thing in the sport once we talk about transfer portal pursuits. And some guys get overpaid in the portal even when they're not really worthy of that, just because guard play is so important when it comes to competing in a high-level conference like the Big Ten, and not just competing in the Big Ten, but making an NCAA tournament run. So Mingo, you've got to keep. He's a must keep. He's essentially your beacon of hope for the future. That's been the case since Penn State signed him as a blue chip recruit out of Long Island Lutheran in New York. And that's even more of a case now that you saw flashes of what he could do as a freshman at Penn State. I thought he had a case to land on that all Big Ten freshman team. It didn't happen, but I think he's that kind of player. He's got all conference potential and ability. So the conversation starts there. It has to. Urich is another one where you go on social media and you see some people saying, oh, well, he can't defend at this level, but I think he's trending in the right direction. Final 6 games of the season, he played really, really well in the front court for Penn State. And yeah, I mean, he needs to improve defensively. He needs to not get bumped off his spot so easily. I think that comes along with getting stronger and going through a second year in a college strength and conditioning program. So he has a really high ceiling. He's a big part of what Penn State wants to accomplish for the future. I think keeping those two guys very, very important. And they know that in the Bryce Jordan Center. They know that those are the two guys that they really, really need to keep around. And beyond that, I mentioned Freddie DeLeon earlier. He can do it at this level. He's proven that he could play at a high major level. He's entering his final year of eligibility. I don't think anybody would fault him if he decided to look elsewhere for maybe a little bit more proven of a winner, a team that has a little bit more established of a chance to make it to the tournament. And I think there's also a world where if he were to explore options elsewhere, it's kind of a reset. And it allows you, probably frees up a little bit of your resources to retool your roster in a different way than you may if he ultimately decides to return. So I think there's an interesting dynamic at play there. There are some glue guys as well that I think are worth keeping around, especially considering that they may come at lower price tags. That's a part of roster building that we need to discuss. Guys like Dom Stewart, he's probably not, you're not best suited running Dom Stewart out there for 20 plus starts in a year, but he can be a really good guard for you off the bench heading up that second unit. He's a guy who falls into that conversation. 2 more players that Penn State brought over who are young and I think still have pretty high ceilings and their best ball ahead of them, Mirvor Turner. Daniel, how do you say his name? I always butcher it.
Meli Tunja and Tibor Mirtic.
Okay. Well, Charlie
was trying to help you out there. Yeah.
He likes both of those guys, I guess. But we talked about it after the article went up on the board. Year 1 to year 2, I think they can grow a lot. So keeping those guys around, I think it behooves you as a program. You're just adding to your depth. Because look, you got to build a competitive roster somehow. You need bodies in some sense. Those guys can take strides. They're worth keeping around. And then Mason Blackwood, I want to touch on him as my final one because he came on strong behind the scenes throughout the year. And then it finally came to light in the Big Ten tournament when he got a start against Northwestern. The kid just outworks people, and the staff loves that about him. Daniel and I have discussed it. We didn't see a lot from Mason Blackwood throughout the year that made us say, all right, he falls into that must-keep category. But as the year went on, and you start to ask around a little bit more, Blackwood was a guy making some waves on the practice court, doing a lot of the right things, starting to break through into the rotation a little bit more, earned that start against Northwestern. And I think he's one that they definitely want to keep around moving forward. And I don't think it would really cost you a lot to do that. So that's the retention part of it. One other thing I want to touch on, I didn't touch on it in this piece, but I think it gets lost in the fact that Penn State missed out on Dylan Mingo because we talked about that for months as the center of the high school recruiting approach for Penn State. But they've got a pretty talented forward coming in Jamison White out of the Midwest. There's a lot of excitement about what he could bring to the table. Now, again, you don't want to be in a position where you're relying on some freshman to come in and save the day. You're going to add veteran talent in the portal. But I think Jamison White could supplement and add to what you're trying to build when it comes to this offseason approach.
Let's close on hoops here, Daniel, and put your GM hat on, acknowledging that Penn State is not going to have the same financial resources as a lot of the teams that will be playing deep into March and into early April. But what are the top 2 kind of roster pieces that this team desperately needs if they want to get back to trying to close the gap between being number 18 in the Big Ten versus maybe being a middle of the pack squad?
I think you start in the front court where you need to add proven size. Mike Rhodes has talked about that they want to get older. So I think if you can find a veteran big, kind of like what Tyler said, is that teams want to pay for guard play. Teams also want to pay for big men. I think every team across the country would look around and say, like, yeah, we need to add a veteran big to our roster this offseason. So that's a tough pool to swim in. But I think you saw it this year, when Ivan Juric had to go out, and then you would put Sasha Ciani in there, or Justin Hauser minutes. The drop off there was pretty noticeable. I know they tried to shift some things around by trying to go small with some Josh Reed minutes at the 5. Murtic getting hurt in January and missing the rest of the season. That didn't really help because he was a little bit of a bulkier guy. But I think that you need to add size, and preferably older size down low. I think the other thing is that you need to find shooting. That was a pretty big issue for Penn State this year. It was that Mike Rhodes said that, I think he said that he wanted his team to take 33 pointers a game earlier this year, and they just didn't get to that number because they just did not have consistent outside shooting. Mingo, he maintains that he can, he's a better shooter than he showed this year from the outside, but he had some struggles. Dom Stewart, I think he was 11 for 17 through the first couple of games of the year. His average, I think, finished around 30%. And then Eli Rice, who was supposed to be that sharpshooter. He had a couple games where he lit it up, and you could see, if he gets hot, this is what it looks like. But there was just no consistency for him over the course of the year, and he would disappear at times. I think he's had a couple injuries, and I think that he was a little bit of a defensive liability, and then he ended up being a DNP, in the Big Ten tournament. We don't know if there was an injury popped up or anything like that, but I think that was pretty noticeable because he started a handful of games this year. So it sounds really easy on paper, just say, oh, get bigger and get better at shooting, but I think probably every team in the country is going into this offseason with that same mindset. And so I think that in addition to supplementing your roster through the portal, and maybe finding some late signings in the high school ranks, like they didn't bring in Ivan Juric until May last year. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But it's going to be a big season for development. I think that we're all confident in what Brent Scott can do with Juric and even with Justin Hauser in terms of bringing them along as big men. But these guards like, Dom Stewart, Caden Mingo, they need to get in there, get that outside shot, really dialed in, for when they come back next year to really add another element to this team.
Well, Daniel, I applaud you for all the coverage during this Penn State basketball season. I know you have been great coverage if they were a great team, great coverage when they're a bad team. That's why we love you around here. And a big shout out to Mark Brennan. I don't think anyone has covered more Penn State hoops collectively than Mr. Brennan. And he endured this season as well. We'll see what awaits this offseason. I do have to say this will be probably even more painful for Penn State fans if you were watching Micah Shrewsbury go dancing. But he ain't coming close to dancing. And in fact, that seat is getting hot in South Bend. 15 games under 500 in 3 years with Notre Dame, 20 games under 500 in the ACC, 33% win percentage in ACC competition for Shrewsbury since leaving Penn State and joining Notre Dame. Guys, I think that's going to do it for this episode. I want to give Daniel one more chance to talk because he covered Penn State hockey, which still has a chance to go further down and continue its winter sports season. They won their opener with Daniel in the house for the Big Ten tournament. Tell us what's going on with that and what kind of coverage you plan on providing.
Yeah, the Penn State hockey team beat Minnesota in the Big Ten tournament quarterfinals 6-2 on Wednesday night. It was a big win because they had really stumbled down the stretch. They were 2-6-2 in their final 10 games. They got swept by Wisconsin at home in the final series of the season, and what was like two pretty ugly games of hockey. It just a team that looked like it was kind of backing into the postseason, limping in. They came out, played really crisp on Wednesday night, and they're going to go to Ann Arbor on Saturday to face number 2 seed Michigan in the Big Ten tournament. I believe, I'm not as familiar with the hockey bracketology, but I believe they're pretty safe when it comes to the NCAA tournament later this month. I think the win against Minnesota really solidified that. But, they're a team that is uber talented. We've talked about Gavin McKenna before, like potential number 1 draft pick in the NHL this summer. He has been box office at times this year. Like, you watch him and he is, very, very different to everyone else out there. And, the guys have talked about it where, this team is much more skilled, has much more high-end skill than last year's that went to the Final Four. So there is a chance that they get into the postseason, they can get hot and make a run. So we'll have coverage of that. It's going to be interesting to see. There is the outside chance that they could host a Big Ten title game if they beat Michigan and number 1 seed Michigan State loses to Ohio State. So we'll see about that. But yeah, stay tuned. It's been fun, a little bit different coverage. We have some really knowledgeable posters, on our message board who have been really great resources throughout the year. One other hockey note, the Penn State women's hockey team, they won their 4th straight AHA tournament title last weekend. They're hosting an NCAA regional for the first time this weekend. They'll play Saturday against UConn or Princeton, and they only need to win once to reach the Frozen Four, which is going to be at Pagula Ice Arena next weekend. They're a team that hasn't really had the chance to break through yet. It's one of those things where I think they essentially play in like a mid-major conference. And then when you go up, take that step up in the tournament, play with the big kids, it can be a little difficult. But we'll have some coverage of that on Lions247 as well as, they go through they go for a breakthrough. Tessa Janicki is a finalist for the Women's Hockey Player of the Year honor. She won a gold medal last month with Team USA over in Italy. So they're also a fun team to watch. So yeah, it's more than a football school. It might not be a basketball school, but there's some other stuff going on as well.
Yeah, of course, the women's basketball coach fired recently. So not a great banner year for basketball, but wrestling, hockey, still on our radars here at Lions247.com. We'll have coverage as those seasons continues and national championships are pursued. And before we say goodbye, Tyler, I really enjoyed your piece that you put up on Thursday morning at Lions247.com. For those who live and breathe Penn State football recruiting, there hasn't been a ton of tangible evidence of what the staff is doing quite yet because they're still waiting for that first 2027 commitment. But 3 things I know, 3 things I think about Penn State recruiting going into the spring. First off, I love the structure. I wonder where you came up with that. Something I enjoyed doing last season. Just tease that for us and a reminder to folks, 50% off VIP access and essentially all the recruiting coverage at Lions247 is behind that VIP paywall.
We've learned a lot about Penn State recruiting over the last 2-3 months. There's still a lot to learn. A lot to learn about the way the board's coming together, a lot to learn about the staff's overall approach to things. But there are some things we know for a fact at this point, and there are some things that we feel we have a pretty good grasp on at this point. And that all plays into that piece. Like I said, there are things we know, hard, concrete, so I dove into that. And then some things that we've been able to pick up on, just intel-wise, approach-wise. Like I said, there's still a lot of time left in this 27 cycle. It might not feel like it. I know some people are starting to get a little bit antsy because there's not a commitment in the class just yet, but there's still a long way to go. Now, I know official visit season will be here before we know it, and that'll be a pivotal time. Spring practice will be a pivotal time for this staff on the trail. You're going to start to see some movement. So it's an in-depth piece. I enjoyed writing it, so I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I think our subscribers will enjoy reading it as well.
Check that out at Lions247.com. A lot coming your way on the site. We went pretty long on both episodes this week. We had a lot to catch up on after vacation, and we'll start to bring the plane down for a landing next week as we near a return to the practice field for Penn State spring camp. We'll come back to you with a couple more episodes. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. They are Tyler Calvaruso and Daniel Gowan, and this has been the Lions247 Podcast.